Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Command & Conquer Red Alert 3 for PC, Mac, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is a real-time strategy game and the sequel to Command & Conquer Red Alert 2. It was developed by EA Los Angeles and published in October of 2008 for PC, and then it later got released on Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Mac respectively. And it's kind of interesting because while some fans were not particularly happy with Command & Conquer 3, this is where public opinion kind of turned against the Command & Conquer series. And it's kind of weird because the critic reviews for it were generally pretty favorable. They seemed to think it was not very innovative, but it was not a particularly bad game as far as they were concerned. But then again, we all know how that can be. But it's worth noting that quite a lot of fans were very vocal in their complaints about this thing, and their complaints were many. But the real question here is, how is this as a follow-up to Red Alert 2? How is it as a follow-up to Command & Conquer 3? And does it shake that feeling of basically trying to be Command & Conquer generals, only with a slight change here and there and just expecting that to work? Well, before we really get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, which is a step up over the previous game in terms of visual quality. But there was a change that left a lot of people cold and other people were fine with it. It's purely a subjective thing, and that is the art style. It's gone back to this really cartoony kind of look, and while it actually works really well for the Red Alert series, I can see where people would be bothered by it, because it is a change over the more realistic look that the previous games had. And while I certainly didn't have any problems with it, I'm sure there are some people out there who are going to whine and complain no matter what they do to the art style. But again, a cartoony art style fits this kind of game because it's frankly absurd and silly. And it's just nice to have something that is bright and colorful for a change in an era where everything was really becoming brown and gray and realistic. So that certainly helps it have a fair amount of charm. But then there's the visual quality, which, like I said, is a step up over the previous game. The modeling, animation, texture quality, all of that is better than the previous game, Command & Conquer 3. But what especially looks good in this is the water effects. They still look fantastic. Even though this game is 7 years old at this point, those water effects are just phenomenal. And then there's the other aspects of the presentation, which is to say things like the cutscenes, the sound design. As far as the cutscenes go, they are once again FMV cutscenes, which is greatly appreciated and definitely welcome in a Command & Conquer game. And they've actually got a fair number of pretty big actors in this. I mean, you got J.K. Simmons, Tim Curry, Jonathan Pryce, Peter Stormare, George Takei. It's just a pretty crazy lineup they've got going on with this thing, and it's kind of funny to see them doing something as incredibly cheesy as this game is, actually. And a lot of the performances end up coming across as corny and ridiculous, and you got the feeling that they were fairly amused doing these. And then there's the FMV cutscenes in relation to the advertising campaign, which was pretty hefty leading up to the release of Red Alert 3. And it's kind of weird compared to the rest of the games in the series, because they didn't really do as much with the FMV stuff in the previous games' advertising campaigns. So right off the bat, you kind of get the impression that they were really banking on the big name actors and the models and things like that they threw into this game. And that also creates a problem that a lot of people point out. The game kind of comes across as trying to rely on sex appeal in a lot of regards. For example, they got models to play characters like Ava McKenna, and of course they got Jenny McCarthy, who is a former Playboy model and is a completely insane woman, but that's beside the point, to play Tanya this time around. And she's blonde, and it's just not what Tanya was. It ends up being a just weird, contrived change that is actually kind of annoying as you go through the game. Some of it isn't too bad, and to be fair, some of them do actually turn in pretty decent performances, but it still feels like it's pandering to the sex appeal kind of thing. and that frankly doesn't really belong in a Command & Conquer game at all. But then we come to the sound design, which is generally a pretty big improvement over the previous game in the series, Command & Conquer 3, and that's because they got Frank Klepacki to work on the soundtrack again. He only did 3 tracks, one of which is Hell March 3, hell yeah. But even apart from that, the rest of the soundtrack feels like Command & Conquer this time. At least apart from the Soviet March kind of stuff that they've got in there. But there's a lot more of this kind of rock or metal stuff going on, and it just fits Command & Conquer perfectly, and really does feel like a continuation of something like Red Alert 2's soundtrack. It's not quite as good, but it's still way better than the crap we got in Command & Conquer 3 that was completely forgettable for the most part. So there is that. And like I said, it's always nice to have Hell March again. So that goes a pretty long way for this thing. And they also remixed a couple of tracks from previous Command & Conquer Red Alert games like Grinder. So that all works to make it feel like a proper sequel to Red Alert 2, at least in terms of its theme and tone. And as far as the voice acting goes, it's pretty solid stuff for the most part. They've got some pretty corny lines in there, and they're played out fairly well to give a decent comedic effect. So they did a pretty decent job with that as well. There's not really any particular part of the presentation that is completely at odds with the rather campy and ridiculous feel of the game. But again, that's going to be something that's pretty subjective. A lot of people are not going to like that, and some people are going to like it. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that the Soviets are facing complete and utter defeat at the hands of the Allies, and Colonel Cherdenko and General Krukov decide to go back in time, mostly it's Cherdenko's idea, to 1927 in order to actually eliminate Einstein and thus eliminate the Allies' technological edge in the war that allowed them to actually just smash the Soviet Union to bits, basically. And so that ends up changing the present, which when they return, they find out that Cherdenko is now the premier of the Soviet Union, and they are on the brink of completely conquering Europe. But then they find out that in changing the past, they actually precipitated the rise of the Empire of the Rising Sun. So now you have an extremely technologically advanced Japanese empire on the warpath. And this creates a three-way war where the Empire of the Rising Sun attacks the Soviet Union first and then goes on to everywhere else. And what you end up with is a plot that is completely absurd, and luckily enough, they don't seem to take things all that seriously. Which is a good thing, because if they had, then the plot would probably be absolutely horrible. But it's almost played for laughs. And there's just tons of inconsistencies and plot holes. Like, if Einstein was eliminated in the past and thus didn't create the chronosphere, why did the Allies get a chronosphere? And things like that just don't really make a lot of sense. But then again, we're talking about a game where the Russians get friggin' attack blimps and war bears, and the Allies get dolphins that use sonic weaponry to destroy ships and things like that. And of course, the Empire of the Rising Sun, being Japan, of course they have mechs. Why wouldn't they have mechs? And it just ends up being this completely ridiculous, nonsensical madness that you kinda can get caught up in pretty easily. If you go into this thing expecting any sort of plausibility or logic to things, you're going to have a bad time. But if you go in knowing this thing is going to be just stupid and roll with it, it's actually pretty amusing. But, of course, the plot itself is pretty crap, I have to say. It's just that because it's played at such a ridiculous level, it ends up being entertaining despite its low quality. And this also goes into the characters themselves. They tend to be kind of over the top and ridiculous themselves, and so even though they aren't very well characterized, and most of them really aren't all that interesting, you do have a few that are just kind of ridiculous and fun to have shouting over-the-top patriotic phrases here and there, or really nationalistic phrases, and you just easily get lost in how completely absurd the game is and how not seriously it takes itself. This was a big problem for a lot of people. For some bizarre reason, Command & Conquer fans got it in their head that Red Alert was supposed to be something serious, but then they kind of forgot that the Soviets get friggin' Tesla coils as weapons, and there were mind control things in Yuri's Revenge, and even better, there's a squid as a unit in Red Alert 2. This series jumped the shark a while ago, and this one is just rolling with it. So people who are acting like this is a complete betrayal of what Red Alert is really missed the point of this sub-series entirely. The only one that was actually played fairly seriously was the original Red Alert, and frankly that was kind of a detriment to it. But then we come to the actual gameplay, and this is where things become problematic. In theory, it's pretty much just a continuation of Command & Conquer 3's stuff with some slight tweaks here and there. But in reality, they change things up enough that it actually becomes pretty irritating to play. For example, you no longer have ore fields or Tiberium fields or anything like that. You have dedicated ore mines, and you have to build your refineries in very specific locations in order to actually be able to get resources from them. So that actually becomes pretty annoying when you only have a couple of these ore refineries available, and they are only available in these specific spots, so it just pretty much limits how you can actually produce your base. Another thing that you'll find is that bases get pretty cramped pretty quickly, but that's something that's been a problem in pretty much all of the Command & Conquer games. It's just exacerbated in this one because the maps are actually quite a bit smaller than the previous Command & Conquer games. There is no 8-player mode in this now. It only goes up to 6 players, and they clearly built the game around the new co-op system rather than actually being pretty much just a Command & Conquer game. So that does present a few issues here and there. Like I said, the maps are smaller. That can lead to pretty cramped bases. It leads to very fast gameplay, sure, but it quickly devolves into the same kind of crap that happened in Command & Conquer 3. You're going to have a few units that you go to that are just capable of completely and utterly annihilating the enemy, and you're going to just gravitate directly to those and forget about everything else, basically. Even though units now have secondary abilities that they can activate. For example, conscripts now are no longer just basic infantry. They can also switch over to a mode where they can throw Molotovs at things and clear out buildings like that. So they basically take the role of the Rifleman Squad and the Grenadier Squad from Command & Conquer 3. And you'll notice that a lot of the stuff in this is basically just copy-pasted from Command & Conquer 3, maybe with an ability tacked onto it. And it feels very repetitive coming from Command & Conquer 3. And that's even though they switched it from the squad units in CNC3 back to the single units that you saw in the rest of the series, and they brought back the naval side of things. Although, honestly, I didn't really use the naval stuff all that much. I mean, I mostly use it as a bombardment platform, so I can just have my ships out in the sea off the coast, way out of range of the enemy's units, so they can just rain fiery death upon the enemy bases and just completely smash them to bits. That said, you can go for naval supremacy if you want, and that is a perfectly viable way to win, except for the fact that, again, you're gonna gravitate to the be-all, end-all unit and just stick with it. And because you're gonna gravitate towards those units, you may not necessarily notice that there is actually a fairly significant balancing problem in this thing, where they tried to make a bunch of units more unique, but in the end, they just made some units blatantly overpowered compared to others. For example, some of the Japanese units are just so incredibly versatile that they can take down pretty much anything with incredible ease, and some of their higher stuff in the unit progression is just straight up ridiculous in terms of its power. And this is all on top of having things like super weapons still available. In fact, each side basically gets 2 super weapons of some description. And one of them is ludicrously powerful, like the psionic devastator for the Japanese, or the orbital drop, where the Soviets just basically make a satellite crash into things. And even though these super weapons are pretty fun to use because they just cause massive devastation, they also kind of break the game. And it's pretty easy once you've been hit with a super weapon to just completely lose because you can't do anything anymore. So you'll find that the balancing problems in the game are really apparent in Red Alert 3 versus the previous games in the series, even though the previous games also had some pretty significant balancing problems. It's just kind of odd how the game worked out that way. And I think part of it is because the game is just so incredibly underwhelming. It feels like a rehash this time around, as opposed to Command & Conquer 3, which felt like it was just trying to take what Generals did and expand upon it and put it into a proper Command & Conquer context, so to speak. This one feels like it's just going through the motions. It's not really trying anything new or interesting, and it really shows. The most they do is bring back naval battles and do some slight tweaks to things here and there. They threw in a co-op mode. Whoop-de-doo, you can't even play it anymore because it used GameSpy. And even then, that also presents something else that's wrong with the game, in that the campaigns are incredibly easy, mostly because you are always paired up with an AI commander, and they basically win the game for you, or they'll just take all the beating for you so you can build up your massive force and just go forth and conquer. It's actually pretty sad how this game turned out. It's not a horrible game or anything like that, but it's just really disappointing, and the only really noteworthy thing about it is its cast. The FMV stuff is fairly amusing for the most part, and even though the game does have a pretty decent sense of humor about it for the most part, it's just not a very compelling RTS. They did too many things that just didn't work right in Red Alert 3. The lowered player count, the emphasis on co-op, the making the campaigns too damn easy, the campaigns themselves actually being pretty short. I mean, we're talking maybe 4-ish hours, maybe 5 if you take things really slow. If you do anything resembling a quick gameplay style, you are just going to breeze through these campaigns, and there's really not much left after that. I mean, the skirmish mode is alright, but the AI can be pretty bullshit at times, so that's something you need to keep in mind if you're going to try this thing out. So the ultimate problem with Red Alert 3 ends up being that it relies way too heavily on its cast rather than on its gameplay. And what you end up with is a weak story that is still vaguely entertaining just by nature of it being completely ridiculous, the game having a decent sense of humor, but the gameplay just being a complete mess. It's just not built around the same principles as the rest of the Command & Conquer games, and even though it still kind of feels like a Command & Conquer game, they changed up enough that it just doesn't work right anymore without having to reinvent some of the stuff. And while I've played a lot worse RTSs than this, I've also played many better, and by the time this thing came out, it felt pretty much archaic. I mean, it's an iteration on Command & Conquer 3, which was an iteration on Command & Conquer Generals, which was a standard RTS in 2003. This thing came out 5 years later. Games like Company of Heroes had come out in the meantime. Things like this were just being left by the wayside. They were archaic. And while that might suit some nostalgia needs, it doesn't really work in the grand scheme of RTSs anymore. So what you end up with is an extremely underwhelming game. One that I can really only recommend if you get it for a really low price, because it can be entertaining to some degree if the campy storyline catches you and if you're looking to get some laughs out of the acting and things like that, but there's so many other options out there that are way better in terms of real-time strategy games. I give it a 2.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.